This week, 2 life stories. First up, what's it like to write the authorized biography of Philip Roth? His biographer, Blake Bailey, will be here to talk about it. And then, was Lady Bird Johnson more powerful than previously known? Julia Sweig will join us to discuss Lady Bird Johnson, hiding in plain sight. Alexander Alter will have an update from the publishing world. Plus, our critics will join us for the latest in literary criticism. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's April 9th. I'm Pamela Paul. Blake Bailey joins us now from Virginia. His new biography is of Philip Roth. Blake, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so there's a long story to how you became Philip Roth's biographer. You were not his first choice,
No.
But you were his ultimate choice. Can you just give us some background on that process?
I was having breakfast back in 2012 with the late Jim Atlas, who was the biographer of Saul Bellow. And at one point we were talking shop and he said, you know, that Ross Miller is no longer returning Philip Roth's phone calls. We in the biographer business knew that Ross, though we didn't particularly know who Ross was, we knew that for a long time he had been Philip's biographer. I was between projects. I had just finished my third biography about Charles Jackson, who wrote The Lost Weekend. And I had communicated with Philip previously about my Cheever biography because they were pleasant acquaintances. I wrote him a letter. So I had his address. So I wrote him a letter and he invited me to New York and said, why don't we talk? So we did.
And what was that conversation like?
Well, we had two conversations. The first time I came, he was very pleasant, very conversational. A friend of his, Julia Gollier, a former girlfriend, stopped by. She's a psychiatrist, and he has absolute faith in her character judgments. So I think he invited her over to check me out. And we never got around to talking about the prospect of writing his biography per se. And toward the end, I said, I got to go. And he said, well, why don't you come back Saturday? And when I came back Saturday, it was a different Philip Roth. He was far more grim. He was in a lot of pain. He just had another major back surgery. And so I solicitously asked about his back, and he said, you didn't come here to talk about my back, and motioned for me to sit down. And he had this sheaf of questions to ask. And the first question was, why should a Gentile from Oklahoma write the biography of Philip Roth? And I said, well, I'm not a bisexual alcoholic with an ancient Puritan lineage, but I wrote a biography of John Cheever. And I think that's what Philip kind of wanted to hear, just because all his career, he said, I'm not a Jewish American writer. I'm an American who is a Jew who writes, to that effect. And I don't think that he wanted to be judged through a Jewish lens. I think that it was actually kind of an asset, at least in Philip's eyes, that I was coming to him objectively on that point.
So how do you come to this agreement? Because this is an authorized biography, and I want to talk a little bit about what that means. Do you sign something between the two of you, or how did that work?
There's a stigma attached to the term authorized. It seems to suggest that you're being controlled by your subject, that he's authorizing you to write a particular kind of story. That's not the kind of agreement I make. I made the same agreement with Philip that I made with the estates of my three previous subjects. And in the simplest possible terms, he has to give me total access. He has to give me all letters, all documents, let me quote freely. He has to give me access to his person, to his friends, to his family, and even to people who are likely to tell me things that are less than sympathetic, in exchange for which Philip gets to vet the manuscript for factual accuracy, not interpretive content, but fact. And of course, he died before I finished. So his executors, Andrew Wiley and Julia Gollier, vetted it for factual accuracy.
So you mentioned 3 previous biographies, one, of course, Cheever, but also Richard Yates and Charles Jackson. I'm sure each of them had their own challenges. But for you, what was the main challenge of writing the biography of Philip Roth?
There were so many challenges.
We can do 5 challenges if you prefer. We don't have to get to one.
It's really hard to say. For the most part, as I say in my acknowledgments, Philip's cooperation was absolute and honorable. But he was very wounded by Claire Bloom's memoir, Leaving a Doll's House, which portrayed him in an extremely negative light and toward people, not just Claire, but people who had seemingly cooperated with that. In at least one case, a person that he had loved very much for a long time. In the case of that former lover, whom I call Inga in my book and whom Claire calls Erda in her memoir, Philip wanted to insist that I not give her the protection of a pseudonym the way she'd had it with Claire, because according to Philip, the story she had told to Claire was a distortion and a libelous distortion, and that she had forfeited that privilege. And I told Philip, this is a violation of our agreement, and she won't talk to me unless I give her the protection of a pseudonym. And that's that. And he would back down, and he did. That was one challenge. There were many others.
Oh, I want to hear more.
Well, I mean, what people don't understand about Philip is that in many ways, not in his work necessarily, because he had a profound wisdom that the work elicited from him, but in his everyday life, he was kind of an innocent. He didn't get people. And sometimes I would be sitting there and he'd be telling me a story and I would be thinking, I can't believe he's telling me this because it was, tasteless and it was unflattering to him. It was hilarious. Philip was one of the funniest people in the world. But again, that comes out of various facets of Philip's personality. One, a profound loneliness. All this talk about his raffish private life, most of Philip's life was spent in this little cottage in the woods of Connecticut, standing at a desk and living inside his head 12 hours a day. This is not unique to Philip. This is a phenomenon that I experienced vis-a-vis my other subjects too. They don't see people very clearly. They sort of see themselves projected out. They sort of see what they want to see. And Philip needed to understand that though I was very fond of him, I had a job to do. So our relationship was constantly teetering on the cusp between professional and friendship. And that could be an awkward dynamic. But for the most part, I was extremely fond of Philip. There's been a lot of hard talk the last couple of weeks about Philip. And I can assure you that if you knew Philip, it was very hard not to feel tenderly toward him.
Okay, I'm tempted to hear that story or one of those stories that he sat there telling you and you thought, I can't believe you're telling me this. Do you put those things in the book? Because he said to you, don't try to rehabilitate me, just make me interesting. It sounds like maybe this was interesting or at least said something about him.
Oh, sure. Philip wanted to have his cake and eat it too. He gave me everything. It's still all up here on the third floor of my house. Tons of papers, really, that I have to eventually turn over to the Library of Congress. And those include hundreds and hundreds of pages of memos that he wrote to me. And the memos basically contain much of the same material that he told me that night after I came to his house from the West Street Grill. So, so yeah, I thought it was fair game. I mean, I discussed this person, Vanya Farley's model, in chapter 42 of my book. And as you'll see, I'm extremely frank about what transpired between them.
Philip Roth obviously wrote about himself quite a bit, sometimes under the guise of a pseudonym and sometimes not. How truthful and open was his own writing about himself? How did things line up when you were then doing the research?
Philip always said, I wish I'd never published Portnoy's complaint because ever after people thought I was this unserious jerk off artist, etc.
Like people just confused him constantly with his protagonist.
That book brought him a lot. It brought him a lot of money and it brought him international fame. But it also renewed these charges of Jewish self hate, of misogyny, and so on. Philip adamantly said all his life, I am not Portnoy. I'm not this zany, morbidly or compulsively profane jerk off artist. And and my mother was not Sophie Portnoy. She was not this crazily hovering quintessential Jewish mother. Well, the truth is complicated. Bess Roth, his mother, was an extremely competent homemaker and a doting mother and a lovely human being. But there was a lot of Sophie Portnoy that came from Bess Roth. 2 years before Portnoy was published, Roth psychiatrist Hans Kleinschmidt published a paper in which he disguised Philip as a successful Southern playwright and told all these anecdotes that would appear 2 years later in Portnoy. And the way Philip explained that was that, he had shown him an early version of the manuscript and that Hans Kleinschmidt had culled that material for his paper. Well, no, he had culled the material from his psychoanalytical sessions with Philip Roth, and they turned up in a much more stylish and humorous form in the novel Portnoy's Complaint. So there was a very strong biographical basis to that novel and many others.
All right, let's stay with that early biography. Did he know early on that he wanted to be a writer? And was his path to becoming a novelist easy, clear, straightforward?
It was pretty easy and clear and straightforward. Like every other writer of whatever magnitude, his apprentice work was not especially good. And even as it got good from the craft perspective, it was very derivative, particularly of Capote and J.D. Salinger. But his first couple of very derivative stories were published. They were in the Martha Foley Best American Short Stories volume, et cetera. So he was precocious. And, Goodbye Columbus sprung from the head of Zeus when he was 25 and won him the National Book Award at age 26. And to this day, Philip Roth is the youngest ever winner of the National Book Award. But over the course of time, Philip was an incredibly protean writer, and he both inaugurated and passed through practically every aesthetic phase of American literature.
Did he think that that early critical success helped him or harmed him? How did he handle negative critical reception?
Goodbye Columbus, Philip was trying to write. Philip was getting a lot of Henry James and a lot of Joseph Conrad at the University of Chicago, where he was an instructor and in the PhD program. And his friend Dick Stern, also a writer, said, Philip, you're not writing the way you talk. The way you talk is extremely funny and entertaining, and that's the way you need to write. Okay, which was the best advice Philip ever got. And he proceeded to write Goodbye Columbus, which was from a direct experience that had just come to an end, his affair with Maxine Grofsky, who he called Brenda Potemkin in the story. So once he had sort of found his line, that particular book and those stories, they came very easily to him because he was writing in a natural idiom. But then he went back to trying to be Henry James again. And he wrote Letting Go, and Letting Go is insufferable, except for those set pieces where he's being funny. And then he tried to be like Flaubert, and he wrote When She Was Good. And he found himself again with Portnoy's Complaint.
Was Roth one to dwell on reviews, negative reviews? Did he care what other people thought of his work?
Philip cared deeply about what other people thought of his work. He would have denied that. And often he said, I don't read the newspaper of record. Philip read every review, including the one in Boise, Idaho, if he could get his hands on it. And if someone wrote something that wounded him, he never forgot it. He never forgot it. William Gass wrote a very caustic review of, what was it, The Great American Novel. And ever after, if you were a writer and you befriended Philip, one of the first questions he'd ask you is, what do you think of William Gass? It was sort of a litmus test. If you liked William Gass, your friendship with Philip probably was not going to flourish.
Was that part of your job interview?
Happily, he did not ask me about William Gass because I might have flunked that.
What did he think was his best work?
Oh, Sabbath Theater, hand down, which I don't agree with, by the way. But he says the most autobiographical character I ever wrote was Mickey Sabbath. And of course, Mickey Sabbath is extremely impious and libidinous and so on. And he bears a distant kinship to Portnoy, but he doesn't have any of Portnoy's nice Jewish boy guilt. Okay. The truth of the matter is that Philip was as much to the day he died the nice Jewish boy who felt guilty as he was Mickey Sabbath. But he really felt, it became an aesthetic mantra to him to let the repellent in, show the worst of yourself, show the worst of human nature, the human stain, And nowhere did he do that with more exuberance than in Sabbath's theater.
All right. Well, if that's not his best novel, in your opinion, what in your opinion is?
I love The Ghost Rider, which is the first Zuckerman novel. He kind of reverts to the careful Jamesian prose and diction, and it's a beautifully wrought novel. Zuckerman is like Philip was in his youth. He's being persecuted by his Jewish father and by the Jewish knobs of Newark for writing this seemingly self-hating story, which his father says that's a story about kikes. Okay. So Philip seeks another father in his literary idol, E.I. Lonoff, who's loosely based on Bernard Malamud. And there's this mysterious young woman at Lonoff's house. And Zuckerman imagines that she's Anne Frank. And he has this fantasy of marrying her and taking her back to his parents and saying, me and Anne Frank are getting married, because how could they call him a self-hating Jew if he's married to the saint of the Holocaust? And in Zuckerman's imagination, she has survived the Holocaust. And in the morning, her sleeve falls. Her name is Amy Billette. Her sleeve falls, and there's no concentration camp tattoo. And he says, no, the person who would have to disavow his beloved father was not her, it was me. It's just a beautiful, beautiful novel, and one of the best novels about the unexpected consequences of being a writer. So I love that. And I love American Pastoral.
We have not talked about many things, and I just want to run through quickly what we have not talked about because we're out of time. We have not really talked much more about Claire Bloom's 1996 memoir. You mentioned it, Leaving a Doll's House, which obviously was a huge, explosive literary event that he did not enjoy. We haven't talked about his friendships with Saul Bellow or John Updike or William Styron, or his later friendships, especially with young women. We did not talk about his retirement. So I just want to lay all that out because there's so much more in this biography. I do want to ask you one final question. Why did he choose to have his paper sealed until 2050 after giving you full access?
I certainly did not ask for that. And that was entirely Philip's idea. Originally, he had told, I think, the Paris Review, or maybe it was Le Monde, that he was going to burn all his papers. He was going to let me use them for the only definitive biography that would be written. And then he was going to destroy the papers, destroy the evidence, so no one else could come to the task. Eventually, he decided not to do that. That's a question you would have to ask Philip.
Is there anything that you thought as you were finishing up, wow, there's just one more thing. If I could just have asked him this?
Frankly, Pamela, toward the end, I felt like I had heard every story 5 or 6 times. so So, no, I had the opposite problem by then. There's been a lot of talk about Philip as a misogynist and canceling him and so forth. And kind of the worst part of this task is that you can't make everybody happy with a biography of Philip Roth. They either love him or they hate him. And the people who love him think you're too hard on him. And the people who hate him think that you're not hard enough. Philip brought a lot of this on himself. He could behave very badly. And then if you took exception to that, he would mock you for for doing so, because I could explain that, but I don't think we have enough time. But I want people to bear in mind he was an extremely complicated human being, and part of Philip was a darling, darling man. There is a reason why 6 or 7 or 8 of his former lovers came to visit him at his bedside when he was dying, and I saw that. I was there. And one of those people was an 86-year-old former lover named Anne Mudge, who needed a helper to get there. So you must be doing something right if you have that many people who love you so dearly.
Well, I hope you're wrong about readers, that there aren't just people who love or hate him, but that there are people in between. Because as you say, he was complicated. Most people are complicated. So hopefully people have more nuanced and complicated and open opinions, or are open to hearing about more about Philip Roth.
I hope so too.
All right, let's end there. Blake, thanks so much for being here.
It was a pleasure. Thanks a lot for having me.
The book again is Philip Roth, The Biography by Blake Bailey. Tina Jordan joins us now to celebrate our 125th anniversary. Hi, Tina.
Hey, Pamela. So I've been talking mostly about the book review in the early 20th century, but I'm going to skip forward a little bit this week. And I'm going to talk about an issue from January 22nd, 1956. In particular, a column called In and Out of Books. This was basically a gossip column, which ran for years. It ran under different names. The top item caught my attention because it's about the National Book Awards. And it says, the National Book Awards, the book publisher's answer to the Pulitzer, holds its ceremonies right here in New York on February 7th, and they have pulled off something of a coup for their keynote speaker. And goes on to note that they have wangled the, quote, youthful senator from Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy, who had just published mere weeks before Profiles in Courage. So the book review's intrepid gossip columnist somehow tracked down Mr. Kennedy to find out what kind of books he liked to read. And the answer was books about English history, quote, the period of Cromwell and Charles I. Kennedy told our gossip columnist he was fond of Churchill's Marlborough and Cecil's The Young Melbourne. Mr. Kennedy is unable to explain how come an Irishman is something of a bug on English history. But he says that's the way it is. And he goes on. And the very, very last item is about Norman Mailer. And it starts, we've already informed our readers of the new weekly newspaper, The Village Voice, and now we learn our old friend Norman Mailer is to become a columnist. So the book review reached out to Norman Mailer, who said, novelists' interests are large, if shallow. Their habits are sufficiently unreliable for them to say something quite often. Most of us novelists who are any good are invariably half-educated, inaccurate, albeit brilliant upon occasion, insufferably vain, of course, and the indispensable requirement for a good newspaperman, eager to tell a lie as the truth, which made me laugh. Anyway, that was a gossip column for you.
Yes, that definitely sounds like a book review gossip columnist as opposed to like, a fun out in the town style party columnist.
Yes.
I'll take it. That's the kind of gossip I like.
Me too.
Tina, thank you so much.
Talk to you next week.
Julia Sweig joins us now. She is the author of Lady Bird Johnson, Hiding in Plain Sight. Julia, thanks for being here.
Great to be here with you, Pamela.
Why a biography of Lady Bird?
Well, I wanted to write a book about women and power. And to be truthful, I didn't have a subject when I got into this and discovered that Lady Bird had kept this immense record of her time in the White House. And of course, Lady Bird Johnson is married to the American president of the 20th century, perhaps most associated with the word power. So the doors, once they opened, just showed a huge opportunity to discover somebody who I thought I had some feel for, but really did not.
Most people have heard of Lady Bird Johnson, but don't even know what her real name was. So tell us a little bit about her early life, including her name and what her childhood was like.
Her given name was Claudia Alta Taylor, and she was raised in East Texas in a little town called Karnak. She was raised primarily by her father. She lost her mother when she was about 5 years old, and also by descendants of enslaved people who gave her the name Ladybird as a very, very tiny little toddler, and it stuck.
All right, so she gets this name, Lady Bird. I have to ask, was she okay with that name? Did she ever resist it as she got older? Did Lyndon Johnson call her by her nickname or by her given name, Claudia?
As far as I know, he called her Ladybird and he called her Bird. But Ladybird herself, as she grew into becoming the full woman that she became, always used the initials CTJ, Claudia Taylor Johnson, on her notations and memos and in editing the transcripts of her diaries. And later, toward the end of the presidency, said very explicitly, sometimes I wish I had been called Claudia all my life, at a moment when she was looking for the gravitas that went with that word, having given a speech on her environmental vision and been received by being given an azalea bush called Mrs. LBJ in response. So I think she struggled with the euphemism of both that word beautification she's associated with and eventually the name, but not always. She stuck with it for her entire life.
So you say you set out to write a book about power. We're dealing with someone named Lady Bird, someone who is, as you say, wishes she had been taken more seriously. To what extent did she feel like she had power, and did that change over time?
I think that by the time she got into the White House, and even well before, she was well aware of the fact that she was in a very sophisticated and multi-layered political partnership with her husband, Lyndon Johnson, and that gave her considerable power, especially by the 1960 campaign and certainly in the White House, and certainly after they lose a very important aide. She becomes his, to my mind, most important advisor, also political strategist, and she's quite aware of the power and influence she has with him and in shaping the LBJ presidency.
And was that a role that she took on reluctantly, or was that something that she had aimed for?
Well, initially, when the two of them met and got engaged and they have this exchange of love letters, she says to him, "Oh, you're not going to get into politics, are you?" Because he's working already as a staff aide to a member of Congress in Washington. But once he starts to dive into politics, and especially by his campaign in the 1940s and certainly in the Senate, once he becomes majority leader, she's all in. And initially she did it reluctantly, but over time and as she came to experience what it was like to be a Washington political animal, she really took to that role and did it quite willingly.
So that role is political wife. And I'm curious how she defined that. Did she think of herself as having power in her own right, or mostly in helping support her husband and his power?
Well, again, it's an evolution. Until they hit the 1960 campaign trail, I would say, again, she feels that she's doing this in the service of a very powerful political individual, Lyndon Johnson, her husband. But, she also was involved in funding and growing their media company. I don't think that she thought of herself only as political wife, but rather as part of a pretty significant enterprise. But it was the 1950s. So for a woman to think totally out of the boundaries that existed at the time would have been a little bit unusual. Certainly by the White House years, which is the focus of my book, she believes that she's working in the service of a policy and political agenda of the LBJ presidency, and she develops a very important component of it for herself.
What was her relationship with Lyndon Johnson like?
She made a comment in the 1990s to somebody that was writing a book about her, which said, I'm paraphrasing here, you can never understand either of us if you don't understand how totally intertwined our lives were together. They had a very long and complicated marriage. Of course, one focus that has been out there for many years has been to focus on the component of his vulgarities and his infidelities. And I think that's left her as his victim and diminished her of substance. That was clearly not the only component of their relationship. And because Lyndon Johnson was such a volatile and mercurial person, one of significant ambition and insecurity and charisma and vision all balled into one, her role was to both help ground him, but also help him execute that vision. So the relationship has many, many layers to it.
He could be incredibly cruel to her. I mean, not just in the infidelities, but in other ways. There's this anecdote that really struck me in Master of the Senate, just because it's so sort of casually awful. It almost makes you laugh in a kind of cringing way. But I guess there's this event early on in his public life where it's full of very sophisticated Washington crowd. And Lady Bird arrives, and in front of everyone else, and maybe even in front of Jackie Kennedy, he says to her, "Lady Bird, you look like a tumbleweed," making fun of her hair and her dress. How did she take that kind of thing? And did she fight back? Was she his equal in that relationship?
I don't know how she took it at that moment specifically, but I mean, it's mortifying and publicly humiliating to be spoken to that way. But one of the things that I've picked up is that they were mutually harassing one another about how they looked, about their hair, about their body, about the weight, about the clothing that they were wearing. This wasn't just, I mean, they're like an
I don't
old,
know if that makes it better, but okay.
Well, it might not. But I mean, I think to sort of produce some balance into this discussion of the relationship, it seems to me that they were quite in one another's faces about that kind of thing, competing about diet and exercise. And so I don't know whether she was as cruel to him as he was to her. I have to say that. And I doubt it.
It would be hard. I want to go back to the diaries and the role that played in your research and what she wrote about in this, because there are a lot of them, right? And it's tapes and transcripts. Give us a sense of the scope of those diaries. Did she write in them every day? And how personal was she in her diary?
The scope of the diaries is pretty vast. The first entry, and I'll speak to how she produced them too. The first entry is about November 22nd, 1963, the day that JFK was assassinated in Dallas. The last entry is January 31st, 1969. Now Nixon is in the White House and she and LBJ are back at the ranch in Texas. And over the course of those 5+ years, she recorded about 850 entries. So she didn't record every day, but she did record these. She was trained as a journalist and historian at the University of Texas in Austin. And she had little spiral notebooks with her all the time, including on Air Force One on the flight back from Dallas to Washington, D.C., where she's taking notes, astonishingly. So she would gather, and this is the way the custom grew, is that her staff would put together a manila envelope of the day's events every day. She didn't record every day, but she would sit there and record a first draft, essentially, basically from his daily diary, her daily diary, notes, press clippings, memoranda, all kinds of ephemera. And she would talk about the day she was reporting on in a very cogent and descriptive way. Some of it was very personal. She talks about her, not just Lyndon's depression, but her own emotional ups and downs. She talks over the course of the 5 years about the experience of 3 political assassinations, of the backlash over Vietnam, of the triumphs and adrenaline rush from civil rights, about her confusion, about the way the country's polarization is unfolding. It's quite immense in material. It's 123 hours of recording, about 1,750,000 words once transcribed.
What does she say and write on November 22nd?
Well, her entry starts, "It all began so beautifully. We were driving into Dallas." And then she recounts pretty much beat by beat her experience of hearing first the shots and then realizing as the cars speed toward the hospital, what has happened. Turning around, she describes Jackie in her pink suit laying over Jack's body. She describes her encounter now on Air Force One with Jackie, who's covered in blood. It's very dramatic, and Lady Bird's East Texas accent and her penchant for drama and pacing in her own delivery of lines is incredibly emotional.
Can people listen to those tapes?
Oh, absolutely. They're all now, and this wasn't the case when I first started because they were just beginning to release the audio and the full transcripts when I started my research. But now you could just go to the LBJ Library website and search for the diary entries. It's a little cumbersome to find them, but once you find them, The full recording and their transcripts are right there, including a reproduction of her editorial notes in the margins of the transcripts where she's adding commas and fixing punctuation, and sometimes, in a few cases, asking that documents be closed for a number of years. But mainly it's just factual corrections that she's made. So yes, it's all there.
Did you listen to all of these tapes or read all of these transcripts? It's a huge amount of research.
I read every single word of every single transcript. And then what I did is go and listen to the material that struck me as very, very significant. I would listen to it because I wanted to hear how she sounded. And then I listened to a great deal more, not quite all of it, but almost all of it in putting together our podcast series, because that's all derives from her audio.
What kind of sense did you get of her as a person from listening to all of those tapes?
Well, first of all, she's very, very smart. Second, she's got a wonderful way with words. And her ability to paint what one of her staff people described as word pictures really stuck with me. And she can also go in so many different directions. So I found her to be a very disciplined and thoughtful person, and also somebody who's quite disciplined in her execution of this task while having such a large public role and private role in the White House, but also a very controlled person, because although the material does get quite personal at times, she also is doing this for the purpose of legacy, her legacy and their legacy, and because she wants to leave her own record in real time, not just of her observations, but how she shaped his presidency.
You said that she gets quite personal. And earlier you mentioned, of course, there's Lyndon's depression, but also her ups and downs. What were her downs? What was it that troubled her during this period?
I think I could characterize them in a few ways. One was that Lyndon required an enormous amount of her. And sometimes I got the feeling that just putting out so much energy on Lyndon's behalf, his emotional well-being, his political life, the whole of it was quite exhausting. But the second thing is that she talks a lot about the pressures of having to be on all the time, of being in public life. So that's an element. A third element I would say about the downs is that from the very beginning of the presidency, the two of them really doubted their ability and Lyndon's ability to keep the country united. And they knew early on that Vietnam might well derail the presidency. And so the contrast with the highs of civil rights in the Great Society, but the very quick backlash and demand for more by Black Americans and backlash against them from some white Americans, I think really did bring her down. And then, of course, the feeling of being misunderstood around Vietnam and the feeling of coming into the White House as a progressive, but then coming to be seen as reactionary, I think that brought her down.
How closely in sync was she with Lyndon Johnson's politics when it came to not just Vietnam, but also racial issues, women's rights, economic inequality?
On Vietnam, she shared his blinders. She came in understanding that it could derail his presidency, but these two people were children of World War II, and this was the geopolitics of the Cold War, and they felt like betraying an ally, even such a weak and horrible ally in Saigon as they had, would have catastrophic consequences, and they were pressured by domestically, in their minds, by hawks to escalate, and also by Kennedy's team, who they inherited. The second, on civil rights, I mean, she was entirely in sync with Lyndon Johnson. As a Southerner, she understood the intense requirement to level the racial playing field in this country. And she was very, very devoted to that. She campaigned for civil rights in the South during the 1964 campaign. Likewise, on the environment, I would say their environmental legacy, I think, hasn't been written about so extensively, but she was probably ahead of him in trying to bring together in American cities the idea of environmental justice, access to nature, and civil rights. And that's a piece of this story that I think is pretty much untold. On feminism and women's rights, in 1964 especially, before she really dove into the environmental component of her focus, she had this, let's call it a curated feminism. She gives speeches around the country that are very clearly in the spirit of the feminine mystique and of pushing American women to have it all and to be professionals and have a civic life and also raise kids and families. But she didn't dress it up in a kind of radical feminist patina. She was a straight-laced, coiffed Southern wife of a president, and that's how she delivered her message.
People are endlessly fascinated by the relationship between the Kennedys and the Johnsons, and we know that Lyndon Johnson felt very snubbed by the Kennedys socially. How did Lady Bird feel? Did she look up to them? Did she feel rejected by them?
In the 50s, when LBJ was Senate Majority Leader, his power conferred to Lady Bird. And so the Johnsons, in the hierarchy of Washington, the Johnsons were senior to the Kennedys. Lady Bird senior to Jackie, and she brought Jackie into the fold of Senate spouse life to the extent that Jackie participated in it, which wasn't that much, and it was everything to Lady Bird. In the 1960 campaign, Jackie stayed home and Lady Bird campaigned for her. When Jackie was First Lady, now the power dynamics have shifted. Lady Bird is incredibly devoted to standing in for Jackie a lot. And that kind of intimate sharing of ties for Jackie and Lady Bird, I'm speaking about the two of them only at the moment, keeps going through the transition after the assassination. But after Jack's assassination and after Jackie leaves Washington, then the distance really begins to set in. And Lady Bird is, of course, sensitive to the cultural differences between the two of them. But in a way, because of those cultural differences and because of Jackie's star power, she knows she can really never fill her shoes. The relationship gets a lot more tense over the course of the presidency, and we see that especially by the time Bobby Kennedy is assassinated, where Lady Bird is just taken aback by a level of hostility she feels from Jackie when they see one another at St. Patrick's Cathedral. And it isn't really until after Lady Bird is out of the White House, well into the 80s, that those two reconstitute their relationship.
How did they end up doing that?
This is a piece that I wish I had more information and insight into, but how they wound up doing it is that they both started spending time every summer at Martha's Vineyard. And so they would make time for one another every year in the 1980s to spend a day together. And that's how they did it.
What was Lady Bird's life like overall after Lyndon Johnson's death?
Well, Lady Bird lived longer after his death than she had been married to him, or almost exactly the same amount of time. So she had a very long post-presidency. She died in her early 90s in 2007. And when Lyndon was alive and until they got back to the ranch, there was no such thing as work-life balance between those two. But afterward, she had a huge travel bug and she traveled all over the world with her daughters and her grandchildren. And she sat on boards and she helped develop beautiful urban spaces in the city of Austin. And she created the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, which is actually an environmental education center, and put her energy also into the LBJ Library and building that and the LBJ School of Affairs. So it was a combination of legacy and her own personal and family life that she spent her time with.
Earlier, you mentioned that you created an 8-part podcast related to this book. Did you work on both of those in conjunction? And I'm assuming the podcast arose because you were listening to these tapes and just thinking this has to be heard. Or what was the origin and process like?
So first I wrote the book, and as I was finishing the book, over the course of the whole time, actually, as you say, listening to the audio, I just knew that this would make an incredible audio documentary. I mean, a podcast is one way of putting it, but it's what we've done is very immersive. And so as I was finishing the book, I reached out to somebody I know who's works in entertainment and audio especially, and we started hatching this idea to put together the podcast. So the podcast came after the book, but we've released both of them more or less at the same time so that people can read and also immerse themselves in her description of that incredible time in the 1960s when she was in the White House, because there's nothing like hearing her.
Quickly tell us where people can find this podcast. What's it called?
The podcast is called In Plain Sight, Lady Bird Johnson. It's produced by ABC News and Best Case Studios, and people can find it anywhere they listen to podcasts.
All right. And just as important, if not more important, read the book. The book, again, is called Lady Bird Johnson, Hiding in Plain Sight. It's by Julia Sweig. Julia, thanks again for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Pamela.
Joining us now with some news in the publishing world, Alexandra Alter. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela. It looks like there's going to be even more consolidation in the publishing industry. The big news recently on that front is that HarperCollins has emerged as a buyer for Houghton Mifflin Harcourt's books and media division. Houghton Mifflin is the 6th largest trade publisher in the U.S., and HarperCollins is the 2nd. So this is going to create another massive company. This comes after the news that Penguin Random House is in agreement to acquire Simon & Schuster. So a few years ago, there were 6 large publishers. Now there are 5 large publishers. There's going to be 4 very large publishers now. And people in the industry have mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, this gives HarperCollins a little bit of an advantage as they are looking to their rivals getting bigger and bigger. The main thing that they acquired with this purchase is Houghton Mifflin's really remarkable backlist. They have the Tolkien books, they have Philip Roth, they have Robert Penn Warren. So right now, publishers are all looking at backlist as this cash cow that is a perennial source of income for them without a ton of costs because you're not paying out advances or anything like that. On the other hand, I think people in the industry are also concerned about consolidation and what that means for the diversity of titles that get published, what kinds of options authors have in terms of finding a publisher for their books. There's less competition for what authors and agents are out there selling. So there's a little bit of concern about that, as well as among some booksellers who feel like as these large publishing companies get even bigger, they lose leverage with them in setting terms.
What does it mean that this is happening the same year, in theory, that we have the planned merger of Simon & Schuster and Penguin Random House?
I think that is really going to change the landscape. And I think one of the reasons probably HarperCollins was interested in Houghton Mifflin, of course, like I said, it was very attractive because of its backlist, but it makes it all the more urgent for them and for other large publishing companies to bulk up in order to compete with this coming mega publisher of Penguin Random House and Simon & Schuster. That deal is going to undergo regulatory scrutiny. Probably both of them will. One person who I spoke to, a professor who studies mergers and acquisitions and antitrust, said consolidation leads to more consolidation. That's just how this goes. If one company bulks up, everyone else gets nervous and they feel like they also need to grow. And I think for Houghton Mifflin in particular, they're largely an education company. So they saw this as a way to focus again on their education publishing. And so by selling their trade division, they're going to be able to pay down some of their debts and continue with their education. They're really switching over into technology and digital publishing, which obviously makes sense. They saw an opportunity with the changes to education that we've all been through during the pandemic. So that was another reason that they moved and put their trade division up for sale. The concern and the assumption in the industry is that there will be more big deals like this.
So we used to have what we called the big 5 publishers. What would we have if all of these mergers take place?
Well, somebody put it to me this way. We'll be left with the big 2 and the other 2. The other 2 are still quite large. But
what are the other 2?
We have Hachette and Macmillan, really massive companies. And I think another possible reason you're seeing some of these moves as well is that a lot of publishers have had very profitable years during the shutdown, much to everyone's surprise. As we've talked about, people really turned to reading during the pandemic. Book sales are way up in all formats, audio, digital, print, and publishers are making quite a bit more money than they have in the past. So buying another company is not as risky, maybe. I think everyone expects things to slow down a little bit when hopefully the pandemic ends and people go back to movies and plays and restaurants and travel, which actually sounds amazing. But I think their expectation is also that they've brought some new readers into the fold, or that people have rediscovered their love of books and what they get out of reading. And so I think they anticipate that some of those people will remain devoted readers and book buyers.
All right. Well, let's hope so. Alexandra, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us now are critics Dwight Garner and Paul Sigel to talk about what they are reading and reviewing. Hey, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Hey, Pamela.
Dwight, let's start with you. What have you read and reviewed recently?
Timothy Brennan, who teaches in the Humanities Department at the University of Minnesota, has written a biography of Edward Said, the great public intellectual, the author of Orientalism, which, as you know, is his foundational work of post-colonial studies. Said was just a fascinating man. Palestinian American, was one of the great spokesmen in America for the Palestinian cause, and one of the last of the great public intellectuals in America. A polymath, taught literature at Columbia, played music beautifully, wrote criticism for The Nation. He was everywhere, president of the Modern Language Association. And I've been waiting for this biography of Said because Said is such a great character in other people's writing. In Salman Rushdie's memoir, Joseph Anton, Said's a big character. In Christopher Hitchens's Hitch 22, Said is this wonderful presence. In essays by people like Tony Judt and Michael Wood and Tariq Ali, you get these great Edward Said stories. What a sort of fascinating personality he was. So I was really looking forward to this first biography of Said. It's called Places of Mind, A Life of Edward Said, and it's not good. It does one thing obsessively, which is sort of unpack the intellectual groundwork of Orientalism and some of his other books, and which is fine, but the book is very academic and very dry. It reads like it probably should have been published by a small academic press. It doesn't give you Said's life, which was really tightly wound with his beliefs and ideas.
It sounds like you were pretty familiar with Said's life and work before you read the bio. And I'm curious, as a critic, if it makes it harder to review the life of someone you know well, so you can kind of test it against your expectations and your own opinions versus the life of someone you've never really encountered before. So you're reading about it for the first time.
That's a really good question. I remember thinking that way when I read Adam Begley's biography of John Updike, which is a book I didn't love. And I love John Updike, and or at least I've certainly read him with interest my entire life and know his work, nearly backwards and forwards. And I felt that Begley in that book didn't quite capture Updike, and maybe it's because I knew Updike too well. In this case, I don't know Said as well as you might think. I mean, I've read Orientalism and one or two other books of his, but he wrote quite a lot. I've just been interested in him as a figure. When I was, if you're a veteran of the 1980s in this country or the 1990s, Said was everywhere. He was on Nightline and Charlie Rose and the BBC, and he made the Palestinian argument in this country. And he was extremely attractive man and a funny man. And having heard forever, reading various books about this whirlwind that was Edward Said, it was a disappointment to read a book that just felt like it was more interested in how Freud and Derrida and some other thinkers influenced Said. And this kind of thing is important. Said was a serious intellectual and a deeply learned man, but the stuff, it just sort of swamps the book. And you feel like you have a writer talking to other academics, hashing over points that really matter only to a small audience.
It's such a fine balance. I remember when I reviewed Ben Moser's biography of Sontag, finding the opposite problem, right? It focused so much on the life and the affairs, and it didn't give enough space to her ideas. And she was somebody who, like Said, lived in the ideas. That's where so much of the action was. And I think to find that balance between the two and to find how one informed the other is sort of like one of the interesting challenges of the biography.
No, I agree completely. And I've been reading, I can't wait, Parl, to read your review upcoming, maybe still upcoming when this appears, of the Philip Roth biography written by Blake Bailey. One of the criticisms I've heard once in a while is that, Blake Bailey is really great on the life and maybe not as great on the work. I have no idea if that's true, but it's funny. I often feel that if a biographer has to go hard in one way or the other, I'd almost prefer that they focus on the life, because often I've read reams of criticism about someone like Edward Said or like John Updike or like Philip Roth. I mean, I've read enough 2,000-word essays on Philip Roth to last me 100 more lives, and so bring me the life most of the time in the biography. I mean, definitely tied to the ideas, but if I had to err in one direction, I would say normally err in terms of the life. And in this case, the life, the book, this Edward Said book, the life is just sort of left almost completely on the side.
I reviewed a book that has a sort of like interesting, they didn't invent it, but there's a little innovation that it makes in talking about the life and the work. And this week, I reviewed Francis Bacon Revelations, a new biography by Mark Stevens and Annalyn Swan. They won the Pulitzer for a biography of de Kooning a few years ago. And what they do in this biography, this painter who I know and I love and have been anticipating this book for some time, they don't always embed the analysis of the work in the life, right? Like so many biographies will be like, here's some information, the biography, this is the childhood, and then this is where the detail comes that you'll find in this novel or this painting, or this is where this gesture comes from, or the hat or the setting. What they do is there's a little bit of that, but what they tend to do is they give you a lot of the life, and then at the end of each chapter, there's a little space, and then they do a close reading of a painting. So what they do is they put it nearby as if to say, very suggestively, here's the work near the life. But for me, and what I tried to get at in my review is that they're also making an argument that you cannot just read the art for the life or vice versa. You know, there has to be some kind of modesty in understanding where this work comes from. And I hadn't really seen that in this particular way before. And I found myself very grateful for it. And when I point out in my reviews that, so this book is like 900 pages. It's incredibly thorough, but its greatest achievement for me was that modesty, was that humility of all the things that they say that they don't want to try to overanalyze and overinterpret.
I like that approach, though. That sounds really smart. And I'm wondering why it's not employed more often.
I think it is daring in a way. And I think that it also, I'm about to say something I don't know if I believe, but that hasn't stopped me before. Like, let's proceed.
Welcome to the club.
Yeah. But I wonder if it's also that it makes you as the critic or writer less important. You know, if you're not the one who's opening the door and showing this master key and doing that heavy work of interpretation, and instead you're gesturing and you're leaving certain things unexplained and open and loose, that's a very different kind of reading and expectation that we have. It's a different way of being in terms of a reader.
You know, it's funny because you often hear with biographies that if the biography is of a military person, it's kind of like this battle and then this battle and then this battle. And if it's a politician, the risk is that it's this campaign, or passing this law and then this law and then this law. And obviously with literary biography, the risk is this book and then this book and then this book, and the painter going from painting to painting. It's interesting to think about the different ways in which biographers try to get around that chronological list.
It's true. It really works. In the recent biography of Mike Nichols, who wrote that biography? Sorry, I'm blanking.
Mark Harris.
Mark Harris, thank you. He goes from film to film, and these chapters on each film are just miraculous. I mean, he does them on The Graduate, for example. It's just a brilliant chapter. And I didn't mind it there, going from work to work. In Hermione Lee's recent biography of Tom Stoppard, it kind of slows the pace because Tom Stoppard has written an awful lot, and she sort of unpacks every play at great length. And it doesn't work quite as well.
I like the way that Edmund White organized his memoir in categories like, you know, boyfriends. And then he had all these chapters about each boyfriend, then my therapists, then all of his therapists, and then
good.
My books in this way. So yeah, it's very true. We don't see a lot of structural experimentation when it comes to biographies and chronology and biographies and organization.
Well, there was, of course, that Craig Brown,
Oh yeah,
99 Glimpses of Princess Margaret, which I love just for that idea, for the structure.
Well, it wasn't his idea. I mean, there've been a lot of books like that, a fair number of books like that, but he was just so witty that he made it seem, I think, very new.
Yeah. I think he leaned heavily on Barnes's Flaubert's Parrot to sort of organize that one, which again is also like a little treatise on biography and how to do it and why do it.
Is there a model for you of biography, literary biography specifically, or?
I don't know if this is a model, but I love Judith Thurman's biography of Colette, Secrets of the Flesh, which I don't know, I've read more times than I can count. And I think that there's a way that, again, going back to that idea of the balance between the life of the mind and the life of the person in the world and how those two connect, and how for so many writers, where is the real life? Is it at the desk, you know? And I think in the case of Colette, whose own life was so various and packed with incident, that there's a way that Thurman balances everything together so beautifully, and striking that right balance. I found that to be pretty exemplary. What about you, Dwight?
Well, you know, Richard Ellman's biography of James Joyce is sort of a classic, but it's a classic for a reason. I mean, it's just magisterial, and he knows the work backwards and forwards, and it just tells the story with propulsion. I will say, listing a really obvious biography, I'll list one that no one has read, or at least very few people, which is the late James Atlas wrote a biography. Atlas is better known for his biography of Saul Bellow, but he wrote a biography of the poet Delmore Schwartz and Schwartz's life in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And it's beautiful. It runs low to the ground. It reads like a short story almost from the first page. And it's just a favorite of mine. And I'm just surprised that it doesn't get more acclaim.
I love that one too. Yeah, it's so tender. It's so tender.
Everyone always talks about Richard Ellman's Joyce biography, but they never talk about his Oscar Wilde, which I love. Did you read that? Did either of
I
you?
have not read that. There have been
I've
so
read
many
it, yeah.
biographies of Wilde. Have you read it, Pearl?
Yeah, but that's the one. That's the one to beat for sure. I think it pops up in this Bacon book. Am I mistaken in the footnotes? But I think that's another really just masterpiece.
Yeah. I mean, maybe it's funny. I haven't read the Joyce, so it might be that the Joyce is so much better that it's always mentioned. But I always feel like, but what about the Wilde? Why not the Wilde?
I mean, another biography that I'd love to recommend too, which I'm sure, Dwight, I think you must have reviewed this, was the great biography of Naipaul. Is it The World Is What It Is?
Oh, by Patrick French?
Yeah, it is by Patrick French. The World Is What It Is. And I think it's people couldn't believe it when it came out because it does show the writer warts and all. And Naipaul, gave French absolute liberty and said, show me as I am.
All right, let's run down the titles of the books that you each wrote about this week.
I reviewed Places of Mind, A Life of Edward Said by Timothy Brennan.
And I reviewed Francis Bacon, Revelations by Mark Stevens and Annalyn Swan.
Dwight, Pearl, great talking to you both.
Thanks,
you.
Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.